You're listening to Natural Resources University. In this podcast network, our hosts are university researchers and extension specialists, opening your gateway to the science of natural resource management.
Welcome to Deer University, the podcast of the Mississippi State University Deer Lab. I'm Bronson Strickland.
And I'm Steve Damaris. We're both lifelong hunters, deer biologists, professors of wildlife management, and co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab. We explain the latest research, including our own work and that conducted elsewhere.
So if you're interested in deer biology and management, this is your podcast. Every decision you make is a step in your management program, and we give you the knowledge to make every decision count. Welcome back to the Deer University podcast. I am joined today by Steve Damaris. Steve, welcome. How you doing, buddy?
Good afternoon, Bronson. It's great to be here. Great to be anywhere every day.
Yeah, that's valid. It is. It's good to be alive and well. We've got a big topic we'll get into in a moment that we want to cover, but first of all, some exciting news. Really exciting for us because it was a long time coming and we spent a lot of time putting this together. But keeping with our theme of Deer University and a college course in deer management and deer biology and so forth, we developed what we have called our online deer management series. And so these are topics that, I guess a little bit of history, topics that pre-COVID and pre-pandemic when we were doing a lot of face-to-face.
Yeah.
These are the topics that we had in a 2-day short course on deer biology and management. And so these are, most people are used to wanting to watch something or listen for 15 or 20 minutes. This is the real deal. I think our shortest seminar is an hour, and some of them are 2 hours, but they go into great detail about all these topics we talked about.
Yeah, and I tend to get rambling sometime, as you know, and this is a case where, I could talk for 2 hours on a habitat management and pine systems. I could cover whatever I wanted to, and you weren't there saying, come on.
Well, I usually did at the end when you were at the hour mark, and I was like, speed it up, roll it up, right? It's lunchtime. You know the band Led Zeppelin, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you know what your favorite song should be of Led Zeppelin's?
What's that?
Ramble On.
Ramble. Dream On. I like Dream On and Stairway to Heaven.
No, it's Ramble On.
Ramble
On fits you. But anyway.
But speaking of rambling.
Yeah.
So where do we find these rambling treatises on various topics of deer management?
Where we find Steve and sometimes me, rambling on a little bit. We're going to put a link in our show notes. So on this episode, if you scroll down, there will be a link right there, and there will be information how you can log in. And what's exciting, I think and hope, Steve, is that you can log into this and watch, I think we have 10 different seminars. You can log in and watch those free of charge. But we also have an opportunity for people that are in our field. So if you're a certified wildlife biologist, if you're a logger, if you're a registered forester, you can also take these courses for professional credit. And so you can log in and do that as well. So very exciting opportunity. And again, we'll leave information on how to do that, how to log in our show notes.
Yeah, and there's a quiz that goes with every one. And if you're taking it for credit, you have to actually pass that quiz with a certain 70 or 80% correct.
Right.
You can take the quiz if you're in it for free as well and see how you do. Mm-hmm. But you don't, it's free and you can take it and not worry about the exam.
Right.
So like I know when I was in school and you were in school, we'd always worry, well, is this going to be on a test?
Yeah.
Well, it might be.
Most all of it is going to be on the test.
But they don't have to worry about passing the test.
Right. Unless you're seeking credit,
yes.
Then you got to pass the test.
And this is also a really fun day because we have one of our graduate students from the MSU Deer Lab, Luke Resop. And Luke is one of these deer nuts, as many of us are. Mm-hmm. And he likes to study and learn about deer management and deer ecology. He's really gung-ho about that stuff.
I do a little bit of rambling too sometimes.
He's been known to ramble a little bit, but it's all good stuff. And Luke, thank goodness for us, Luke is our kind of social media guy. And if you follow us on Facebook and Instagram and whatever those other...
Twitter and YouTube and everywhere.
Yeah, if you follow us on any of those, the last person to have touched that intellectually is Luke.
That's right. Glad to be here, everybody.
Which kind of leads us into what we're going to talk about today, is because Luke kind of has his finger on the pulse, so to speak, of the feedback that we get. So Luke is on it firsthand. Mm-hmm. I'm kind of secondhand, and ramble on Damaris. You have no hands.
I'm in the ballpark somewhere.
So Luke has gotten a lot of feedback, either directly people reaching out or things that he sees about some confusion that we hope to clear up today, and certainly just provide our opinions on. So Luke, what is the topic we're going to discuss today?
So today, well, I guess as a little bit of context, just as being the person who kind of reads all the comments and responds to messages on our social media platforms, I still see a lot of people and see a lot of comments and dialogue, and a lot of them are arguments, which from my perspective are very entertaining, of people talking about cull bucks and whether or not you should be calling spikes, whether or not you should be calling, culling with a U, not calling. My weird northern accent, I know. Whether or not you should be calling 5.2-year-olds. And I think it's just a topic that every deer hunter, every deer manager at some level interacts with, maybe not like fully, but they all interact with it. And I think it would be good to just kind of, lay it all on the table and ask some questions. And I'm here to learn. And I think hopefully everyone that's listening is here to learn too. So.
Okay. And so you're going to play the role this time of the umbrella. When Ramble On gets to rambling, you're going to stop him rather than me this time.
I'll just let you do that, yeah.
Oh,
That's probably a little above my pay grade. He might dock my paycheck or something.
Okay, Luke, so why don't you start us out then? What are some questions to get the ball rolling here?
So what is a management buck? Does a cull buck exist? What is a cull buck? Can we effectively cull and improve a deer herd, whether it's for genetics, whether it's for antlers, whether it's for anything?
Steve, you want to start?
Yeah, I'll take, we use words because they're meaningful, but oftentimes, in science, we have very specialized words that mean a very special thing. But when we broach into, talking to the lay public and passionate, interested hunters and landowners, they may not quite comprehend the exact meaning of a word that we use. DBH is a very specific word, diameter at breast height, for a tree, and is a very specific way you measure it. You can't get confused about DBH. But when you start talking about a cull buck, what does a cull buck mean? And what is a management buck? We tend to think of bucks when somebody says I harvested a buck and it was an 8-point. To me, that's not telling me much. I want to immediately know what is the age of the animal and what is its position, and then how many typical points, how many non-typical points, what's the scoring, if there's a Boone and Crockett score associated with it, is it gross? I mean, we can get deep down into the weeds, and that's the good thing is it's very specialized and specific, and you know exactly what's being discussed. But when you talk about a word like a cull buck or a management buck, it could mean a lot of different things to different people. So, Bronson, how do you define a management buck, and how might it differ from a cull buck?
Well, I think there's a tremendous amount of gray area and overlap with those terms. And a lot of people will use them interchangeably, and I probably will use them interchangeably as well. I think of cull/management buck it is not the target, it's not the objective of your management. So to use another term that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, what's a trophy? Well, you, Steve, at your place, under your management regime, you kind of have in your head what is a trophy. And typically, being a little mathematical here, a trophy is usually, I think it's very safe to say this, it's above average. It's way above average. It's usually a mature buck or an older age class buck that has above average antlers to be relegated as a trophy animal. A management buck, to me, by default, is not a trophy. So it has below average antlers relative to how old it is. And this is where I get into that overlap and gray area of a management or a cull buck. Some people will then say, a cull buck is the smallest of the management buck category. But to me, I think they're the same thing. I think cull has had a real negative connotation the past decade or two, is because many people will assign that animal that it's inferior. Its genes are inferior. The animal is inferior. I'm not saying that whatsoever. The animal is what it is. It's a product of natural selection and random breeding, and antler sizes vary. All I'm saying is that a cull or management buck is a buck you are removing because it's not a trophy. And you typically have a purpose for removing that deer. And it's not because for trophy status, it's for a management purpose.
Mm-hmm. And so in this conversation with cull buck, management buck, and trophy buck, a really important consideration here is if you're even thinking in those terms, you're wanting more out of your deer herd than just recreationally harvesting a buck. You're not just going out and shooting the first buck you see. You're trying to promote a certain type of buck to be harvested at different stages in its life. And I personally like to think of thirds, because within an age class, within the 2.5 year age of bucks in an area, let's say there's 100 2-year-old bucks in an area, there's going to be a distribution of antler size. There's going to be a bunch that are right around average. There's going to be a few that are really well above average, and there's going to be a few that are really, really low, well below average. And if you remember back to your high school days or junior high, you've learned about the bell-shaped curve, the bell curve. And C is kind of average, and B is kind of above average, and A is well above average. And then on the lower side of C's, there are D's, and then there's F's. And you can think about, on that bell-shaped curve, those 5 categories. I like to keep it even simpler than that and talk about thirds. An upper third of an age distribution is potentially going to be a trophy deer if it lives to full maturity. And again, what's the definition of a trophy? In our context here, we're talking about a mature animal that is well above average antler size. And so a trophy category can be a 2-year-old deer that just hasn't matured yet. And that upper third of the bucks that are alive, those 100 bucks at 2.5 years of age, a third of them, 33, are going to be in that upper third category. 33 or 34 are going to be in the average category, and then 33 are going to be in that lower third. And that's just kind of mathematical reality. You have 100, you divide it into thirds, and you got 33, 34, 33. And so that's how I think of these deer, in thirds within an age class. And so the trophy, you clarified, is something that's ultimately going to be harvested usually at maturity. It can still exist. It exists in a category at all the age classes prior to maturity. And so we want to consider that as if we're interested in trophy harvest, protecting that upper third of the category within each age class. So that upper third is always off limits. The middle third and the lower third are then a function of how intensively you want to manage and when you might want to harvest those animals. So cull, management, trophy, I tend to put the cull name, non-judgmental, it's just a word, it's the lower third, management deer, the middle third, and trophy deer potentially in the upper third at any age class. And it's just a matter of lopping them off or protecting them at different ages based on your approach to management.
But now there are lots of landowners, and I don't know what the percentage is, but certainly there's a proportion of landowners, property managers, hunters out there that they might not be interested in a trophy buck, or their trophy buck or their trophy deer might just be a doe, right? So like which management scenarios does the cull buck, does the management buck apply to, and which does it not?
Well, if we talk about like three categories of management, three goals or approaches to deer management, to me there's trophy management, there's quality deer management, and then there's maximizing recreational harvest. And those three categories or approaches to management incorporate the goals of what do the hunters want and what do the landowners want. If you just want to go out and shoot a bunch of young deer, then you don't care about how old they get. You just want them to get to breeding age and producing more offspring, and you're just harvesting bucks as soon as they're old enough to breed. You let them breed and you shoot them. And it's a year and a half, 2.5 years, maybe, is as old as they get. Quality deer management arrived on the scene back in 1970s, 1980s. It really got going with the Quality Deer Management Association in the 1980s and 90s that established basically a different philosophy. It's not just shoot the first buck you see. They're saying let them go so they can grow. They can grow bigger. And a quality deer management program is not just shooting the first buck, but letting younger bucks grow a little older, maybe 2 more years to 3 years of age. And that's a really nice deer. Most hunters, particularly if you're coming out of a shoot any deer, maximizing recreational harvest system, you get a 3-year-old deer and it's like, wow, that's a nice deer. Mm-hmm. You do that for a while, and those really nice deer, I've got a 120-inch class 3-year-old. Well, that's a great deer when you're starting out, but then, what could he be if he was 5 or 6 years of age? And that people naturally go from a QDMA or quality deer management approach into the trophy system. They just kind of diffuse into it because they're no longer satisfied with the nice 3-year-old deer. They want something better, and so it transitions into a trophy system. And they were rambling. Hit me with the umbrella.
I wasn't going to do that. I was going to add something to complement what you're saying, is that simultaneously what occurs in those, again, you're putting them into thirds there kind of as well. And it's a continuum, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
But usually what goes along with moving from a traditional I shoot anything into a quality, into a trophy, is also the consideration of animal quality, not just because of the harvest, but also the habitat. Those go together. So typically it's people that just want to see a bunch of deer and shoot young bucks and, see 30 deer on the stand. They typically do not have a consideration for animal quality, and they're typically not managing habitat. Mm-hmm. So that's another step and another differentiating point along the way. If you're now managing for quality and older bucks, you start managing for habitat as well.
Yes. You're investing in a young deer, letting it grow for multiple years, and you're going to invest in the habitat that animal is living in.
To maximize the potential of that animal when it gets older.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's one of Luke's deals. He loves that habitat management.
Mm-hmm. That's right. So what are let's say you walk onto a property, right? You're, maybe a state agency biologist, or you're a property manager, and you are interested in the type of management that we're talking about here, where you want trophy animals and you want them to be the best that they can possibly be. So you want them to not only reach maturity, but you want them to be sporting their largest possible set of antlers at maturity. how do you determine which animals are cull bucks? How do you determine which animals are management bucks? When do you harvest them? Is this based on trail camera data, observations, what?
You might hear this a few times, but it depends. So I would say it's going to depend on what kind of data you have for your property, or that your neighbors may have, or that your state wildlife agency. So if you're in fill in the blank county, Mississippi, Kentucky, whatever, and you met with a deer biologist experienced in your area, they can probably lead you down the right path of what the expectations are for each age class and what is below average, average, above average. But if you don't have any outside help whatsoever, then you're going to have to do a study. And it's probably going to be through observation, it's going to be through trail cameras, but you're going to get a feel for that aspect over time when you start seeing a bunch of bucks. And a lot of this, of course, your ability to do this requires, there's no way around it. You got to become more skilled at aging on the hoof to be able to age live animals. And even just being able to put them into yearling 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 5, doesn't have to be the exact age, but being able to put them in those young, middle-aged, mature, and then you're going to start seeing those antlers are above average, average, below average. That's how you do it. I think you just fast forward that process if you have some help from people that know in your area.
Makes sense.
Yeah, so what are those 3 categories at different ages? And let me throw in a little plug for our app on our smartphones. We have an aging app to help hunters. They can look at the body characteristics of deer on this app, and they would find it by searching for what on the App Store?
I believe it is MSUES. ES stands for Extension Service. MSUES Deer Aging. I believe that will pull it up.
Yeah.
Android and iPhone.
Yeah, so they can look at sitting in the stand. What are the criteria for a yearling buck, a 2-year-old buck, a 3-year-old buck, 4-year-old buck, 5 and older bucks? And again, it's not an exact science. You make your best estimate based on the physical characteristics that you're seeing, and a buck at a given age is going to look different in October than he will in December. So you have to understand that change in body characteristics after he's been on a diet and exercise program for 2 months. He's going to look different than he did in the beginning of the trial.
Right.
There's a lot to it, but I don't want to make it sound like it's impossible to do, because people that want to invest in the effort to do it can do it. And Luke, you were asking about how do you determine what kind of deer would be harvested for a particular approach. Before I even get there, I want to make sure that the landowners understand what's their investment is going to be to even try that. Because most landowners aren't going to be willing to do the work and make the investment in effort for a long-term management program to start producing the best possible mature trophy deer. It's not a shoe that is easily worn by most people. So if you're just wanting to do a little bit of management and get away from the shoot the first buck that shows up, you can do some extensive food plots and warm and cool season food plots, maybe do some thinning in your timber, but and then don't shoot some yearling and 2-year-old bucks and get your bucks to 3, and most people are going to be pretty darn happy right there. They don't need to go beyond that.
Yeah. And that goes in with the managing your expectations.
Absolutely.
And it really, I'm pretty sure I've said this a bunch, but it really stinks. It just stinks that if you own a 200 or 300 or 400 acre property, own it, lease it, whatever, and want to manage it, it just really stinks that buck home ranges are larger than 300 or 400 acres when the rut comes. Mm-hmm. So the probability of your success, in all things being equal with your effort that you're putting in, it increases. Success increases with property size, because you protect more buck home ranges
Yes.
when you do that. So that it's outside of your control. And Luke, I'll refer back to a episode we did with William McKinley on this, and I'm going to get it not exactly like he said it, but William said something like, one of the best investments you can make is the $5 or $6 for a pack of hot dogs to put on a grill with the neighbors around your land or your lease, so you can all see if you can get on the same page about not harvesting some of these bucks that Steve referred to earlier that are above average in antlers when they're 2, 3, maybe 4 years of age. Get on the same page, because we've all, this is kind of the saying that we heard a decade or 2 decades ago was, if I don't shoot it, my neighbor will. That absolutely happens. But you're never going to do any different. You're never going to have a different outcome if you don't visit your neighbor and have that conversation. And you may be surprised. They may have the exact same objective you do, but your neighbor didn't know you had that objective because you never got together to talk about it.
And your neighbor thinks that you're the guy that's going to shoot him if he doesn't.
Yeah, your neighbor thinks you're the bad guy, and you think they're the bad guy because you never got together.
Yeah, anyone who spends any time on social media pages, here in Mississippi, we've got Mississippi Whitetails, and that's like the deer hunters page. Pretty much every deer hunter who's got a Facebook in the state of Mississippi is on Mississippi Whitetails. And, the other states that I've lived in have very similar pages, and I see all the time on those pages, someone will post a yearling or 2-year-old buck, which, depending on your objectives, there's absolutely nothing wrong with, and people will get on there and be like, oh, why'd you shoot that deer? And the guy who posted it will be, well, because if I don't, my neighbor will. And I've even seen people comment, well, have you talked to your neighbor about it? And most of the time the answer is no. So it's like, the pack of hot dogs analogy, it's not even an analogy. That's like very practical, and that's real life. Fire up the grill and see if your neighbors are willing to get on the same page with you.
You could even make it venison sausage.
That's right.
Yeah, you can do a deer burger, whatever. Yeah, just get together.
So one of the things I think it would be worthwhile touching on, and I think we've, there have been numerous podcasts where you've touched on this too, but we've talked about age so far. We've talked about nutrition a little bit so far. We've talked about a genetic component. Can y'all briefly give a quick synopsis about the interaction of those 3 factors and which of those we're trying to manipulate in the strategic harvest system that we're talking about here?
Okay. You want me to start?
Go ahead.
Okay. I would say, Luke, that control the things you can control. And this, of course, just what we were talking about a moment ago, this depends on your neighbors, but one of the things you can absolutely control, if you're on a large property or a smaller property with help from your neighbors, you can control age structure. And that harvesting bucks that show the greatest promise for trophy potential, and shooting them too young, typically at 3 years of age, that is the single biggest problem we see with clubs that are trophy management driven. That is their objective. They harvest them too young. The second thing you can absolutely control is the habitat quality on your property. Even if you lease the property, you can do things like food plots. You can work with the landowner regarding, can we thin? Can we burn? Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. But those are the things. Most everyone, at least in the South, you can always scratch out some acreage for a food plot. And then you can also manage nutrition via trigger finger by reducing density. So there is more food per deer on the property. So those are the things you can control. Genetics are important. They're important to us as human beings. They're important for all life on Earth. Genetics are important. We can't do anything about it at a population scale. So are genetics important for that 160 class 5-year-old? Yep. He had the genetic blueprint to be 160 inches given sufficient nutrition and resources and to live long enough. He did. His genetics allowed for that. But at a population scale, we can't do anything about that because it's very, very, very inefficient for a number of things. And this is one of those holes in the bucket type analogies. We have so many leaks in the bucket to try to manage the free-ranging standing crop of bucks for genetics. We have to deal with dispersal. We have to deal with what is called breeding value, which essentially means if a buck has 150 inches of antler, you have no idea if his offspring are going to express that as well. Are those, quote, genes he has for antlers, are they going to be expressed in his offspring? May or may not. You have no idea.
So a high breeding value would mean that a buck's, so if we were in a scenario where we knew a deer's breeding value, which we don't in the wild, but if we did, a high breeding value would mean that his offspring are likely going to have his antler characteristics. A low breeding value means they might look totally different. Is that right?
Yeah.
Like not even resembling?
In general, yeah.
Yeah, like the analogy I like to use is people. We all know couple A, husband and wife, and they have 2 or 3 kids. And in that couple A, those kids look just like the mother. And couple B, husband and wife, 2 or 3 kids. Couple B, the kids look just like the father. And couple C, the 2 or 3 kids, they're a mix. Well, the couple A, that they look like the mother, that the female in that breeding had a stronger breeding value than the male. And so her characteristics, her physical characteristics were expressed in the offspring. And then couple B, was that the one where couple B had they look like the father? And so the male and the father and the female of any mammalian breeding is going to have a breeding value associated with them. And then the ones where they kind of look like a mix of both, they have essentially equal breeding values. And so you never know when back to the 160-10 point, if he has a low breeding value, his offspring aren't going to look like him anyway. Mm-hmm. He looks like he does because of his particular genetics, but he won't necessarily be able to pass that on to his offspring if he has a low breeding value and the dam that he breeds with has a high breeding value for her genetic characteristics.
Which I would guess is a good transition into what I think was the third point you were going to make about, you got the buck's breeding value, which would be great because you know, even if it was just average and he's got really good antlers, on average, if all you were worried about was the buck's breeding value, his offspring might look similar to him, but that's only half the equation, right?
That's only half the equation. So there's a doe, and a doe's breeding value, and that's worse than bucks. At least with a buck, you see, well, there's potential because he's got 160, but we all know that may not hold true. You have no idea. With a doe that you see in the woods, you have no idea what their breeding value might be. And to now complicate it even more, it's not that only the, quote, best bucks are breeding, like in a livestock or a manipulated environment situation where you're picking the best sires to breed all the females. All the bucks are breeding. Yearling bucks are breeding. 2-year-old bucks are breeding. They're all breeding. The only thing you can guarantee that is going to happen with older age class bucks, the mature ones are going to breed. And in some cases, depending on the age structure of the buck segment of the herd, even yearling bucks may be breeding.
Yes.
And that's affected by buck age structure. But
that 20 years ago, we did a really comprehensive study of breeding success in 3 different types of programs, and they're kind of similar to the 3 approaches I mentioned earlier. We had a trophy management, we had a quality deer management, and we had a shoot the first buck that's legal that comes along management. And in all 3 cases, yearling and 2-year-old bucks were doing a significant amount of breeding, even in the trophy system where they had a much greater proportion of older bucks in the population. The young guys were still slipping in there and getting breeding opportunities.
Because you have the peak of the rut, and you have it's a bell-shaped distribution, just like you were talking about earlier, Steve, with buck antler size. And so at any given time during the peak, you have a great number of females simultaneously in heat, and the mature bucks are doing the breeding, but simultaneously there's a female in estrus where there is no mature buck because he's occupied. And so here comes the little yearling. his lucky day or his lucky year, and he gets an opportunity. So that's yet another facet of this. And then Steve, we mentioned a moment ago dispersal. So yearling bucks, the product of that breeding 1 year later is now moving off your property, typically unless you have a really, really big property. And then you have environmental or year effects. And so you're using, if you think you're making a culling / management buck decision based on antler size, you have no idea that year what the influence of the environment was. Is he below average because of drought? Is he below average because it's a flood year in Mississippi? Was mast above average or below average? So there's so much slop in just taking a very quick snapshot of that buck there, his antler size this year, and what offspring he's going to produce. There's too many holes in the bucket for you to manage this on a population scale.
Too many moving parts is another way to look at it. And this has been looked at in terms of the effectiveness of manipulating genetics. We've done simulations with very highly technical genetic modeling programs. We showed after 20 years of 20 simulated years of perfect selection based on the genetic characteristics of the bucks, which you don't know, but our simulation knew, and it was removing as many buck fawns as were produced. It was removing the lower whatever number of the buck population based on their genetic potential. After 20 years of perfect selection on the male side, we barely nudged the genetic potential for antler size. And then our colleagues in South Texas have looked at it in a field situation. And after 7 years, they had
intense culling.
A very intensive culling. They hadn't significantly nudged the average size of the deer left on the property. So it's just not feasible. And so we just need to throw that water out. That bathtub is full of dirty water. Dump it out. You're not changing the genetic composition. But that 160 class buck, the 10.5-year-old 160 class buck, he existed in the population earlier as a younger deer, and he was at least average, maybe above average, as a yearling and a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old. We can't manipulate his genetics, it's what he's got. But we like to talk about standing crop management, and that guy existed as a yearling. And it's our job to help identify him and protect him. If you want the 160 to be around at 5, you can't shoot him at 1, and your neighbors can't shoot him.
So what is standing crop management? What is a standing crop of a buck population? Standing crop is all the bucks existing on a property in a management unit at time 1. You've got a standing crop, and there's buck fawns, there's yearling bucks, there's 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, and the numbers within each age class tend to get smaller with age because bucks die of natural mortality, accidents, harvest, whatever. So the numbers of bucks are declining, but you have a standing crop of bucks on your property. And then you have a standing crop within age class. And I mentioned earlier, if you have 100 2-year-old bucks, that's the standing crop for that age class. Now, 100 2-year-olds, that's on a huge area of land. That's not feasible for a population that's being managed.
Let's clarify another term we've used a lot, not in this episode, but previously. Let's compare and contrast standing crop to a cohort.
Yeah, okay.
Well, a cohort would be a specific, in this case, an age class.
Of the standing crop.
Yes, yeah. So all of the 2.5-year-old bucks were born, roughly 2 years earlier. So every birth pulse, every summer, let's just generalize, summer, you have a birth pulse of fawns. That is a cohort. And that cohort, the next year is 1 year old, and then the next year 2 years old. So you follow that cohort over time. Now the standing crop is the cross section on your property of all of those cohorts that are alive on the hoof on your property. So it's like Steve said, it's buck fawns, it's yearlings, it's 2, 3, and hopefully some 4s and some 5s or greater. That's the standing crop but it's composed of year-specific age classes or cohorts of bucks. Now, would you explain that a different way, or is that
perfect?
That works for you? Okay. Luke, does that work for you?
Yep. Works great. Yep.
And then so what we do with this standing crop is we tinker with it as managers. And every hunter is a manager. They're going to pull the trigger or not pull the trigger. They have to make that harvest decision. And that gets back to where Bronson was talking earlier about needing to understand what your population is made up of. What does the standing crop of yearling bucks, what do they look like? And if you want to try to start tinkering with some of those yearling bucks to remove them as part of population control, not for genetic management, but just there's only a finite supply of food, and if you're trying to raise them to trophy status, you have a 5 or 6 or even 7 year investment in them, and you can't have every deer living to 6 or 7 years of age, or they'd eat you out of house and home. And so what we're trying to do is provide that upper third, or maybe the middle third and the upper third, a chance to live to maturity under the best nutritional circumstances. And that requires intensive habitat management and population management with removal. Everybody accepts, 50 years ago, 40 years ago when I was in your place, the big thing was teaching hunters to shoot does. They didn't want to do it. And then we educated a couple of generations of hunters, and now most hunters get it. We have to harvest our doe population. But we've trained them back in those early years to don't shoot young bucks. Well, now we're trying to retrain them a little bit for those that it's appropriate. Don't just protect every buck. Consider the finite supply of food, and if your goal is to produce the very best quality animal at maturity, then you don't want every buck growing up to full maturity. If you're in a quality deer management program, don't shoot any yearlings and start plucking a few out of there at 2 and harvest heavy at 3, and most people are happy with that. But if you want to go beyond that next step, you want to take it and see what is the very best I can do, then that requires population regulation of not just does, but the buck population. And you need to remove some. Which ones do you want to remove? You want to remove that lower third and maybe blend in to remove some of the middle third, but you absolutely want to protect that upper third.
So instead of going to all the work of, either running a trail camera survey or talking to your local biologist and figuring out what average antler characteristics are for a specific age class of deer, why not just use like an antler point restriction and say that, we're shooting every deer with less than, or just protect all the deer with greater than 5 points. So you can't shoot any deer with less than 5 points. Protect all the other ones, and then those, because they're the largest, should grow into the biggest deer. Why not just do that?
I typically explain, so that's in a presentation or thoughts and discussions I have on antler restrictions, the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's kind of how that's usually titled. And the bottom line, and this is what we found, feel very strongly about this because Steve and I did this, oh lordy, a while back. And we simulated this process using deer pen data, not just ours, but from other universities as well, so a really big sample size. And we simulated what an antler restriction is doing. We then also paired that with what was going on in Mississippi with their first antler restriction, the 4-point rule, many, many years ago. What we determined with that analysis was success depends on what you're looking for. And what I mean by that is, were antler restrictions effective at changing buck age structure? Absolutely and definitively, yes. They protected bucks that way back when from being shot as yearlings. They were shot at 2 and then some shot at 3. So they improved buck age structure. If that was your objective, then check the box. It's good. The necessary, and I'm using that word, necessary, consequence of that is that you are going to engage to some extent And it depends on how intense your harvest is. Are you moving 10% of the bucks, 20% of the bucks, 30% of the bucks? You are going to, quote, high grade a cohort by doing that. And that simply means, way back to the bell curve that Steve talked about, within your yearling bucks or 2-year-old bucks or whatever, you have a distribution of antler scores. Some of those 2-year-old bucks or yearling bucks are going to be above average. And the worst thing is an above average yearling buck gets harvested. So way back in the 4-point rule days, you got a yearling buck. He's got 6 points. He's legal to shoot. Guess what? He gets shot. And so year after year after year, you're cropping off the very best of the yearlings, and then that lower third or average moves into 2-year-olds. What we saw, and again, verified with simulation and then what we saw in the wild, the age-specific antler score went down. So progress that they were harvesting older bucks, but an unintended consequence of that was the average 2-year-old and 3-year-old buck antler size, when that was implemented, went down. Because the bucks that had the best potential to express antler development at 3 years of age, they're already dead. They got killed as a yearling.
So the average hunter sees more 2-year-old bucks, and their take is, hey, this works. I like it. There's a lot of support for antler restrictions because it protects deer and gets them at least 1 year older. There's a lot of variations in how they do it across different states, but generally hunters support them because they get at least 1 year older, and the average, if a buck goes from 1 to 2, his antler size on average is going to double. So just getting deer another year older really makes a lot of sense to hunters. They see a difference. But what they don't see is that average antler size within the age class, or that cohort average size that we were able to analyze them. And we looked at this across multiple soil resource regions in Mississippi. It wasn't just true in the Delta. It wasn't just true in the higher quality soils. It was true in the kind of medium quality soil resource regions. It was even true in the lowest quality soil regions. That high grading with antler restrictions can be detrimental to average antler size of the cohort at later stages. Now, what that shows is you can manipulate the standing crop with harvest. Well, what we propose, if you're interested in bigger antlered, older deer, then apply that same principle, manipulate the standing crop with harvest, but turn it totally opposite.
Flip it around.
Flip it so that you're protecting the better quality younger deer. And if you're going to shoot some younger deer as part of population control, lop off that lower end, not the upper end that antler-based restrictions tend to allow to be harvested.
And that should really, I would think, that should provide a sense of relief to some hunters that have big doe management objectives. You need to shoot X number of does on a property, but if you're protecting all of your younger bucks, you're going to have to shoot, say, 150 does if you have a big property. But if you are implementing this strategic harvest system, now you can remove some yearling bucks, you can remove some 2-year-olds, some 3-year-olds that are all in the lower third, and you might not have to shoot as many does to meet your objectives.
Possibly. We're not saying you'd be reducing the number of does, but you wouldn't have as much pressure to shoot more does. The biologists give you a little break on the does if you're removing a good number of bucks as part of population control. And I want to, before we get in trouble with our state agency friends and colleagues, we're talking about Mississippi 4-point rule, and we identified that problem, and that led to regulatory changes. The state agency, who wasn't necessarily originally proponent of the 4-point rule, but it was legislated. But after we showed that the 4-point rule wasn't working, they said, well, let's develop another antler criterion because it's hard to regulate selection. And so agencies have to usually do it based on antler criteria. So they said, well, we won't use the 4-point rule. We're going to use an inside spread or main beam length. And that protected every single yearling buck. And a whole lot of the 2-year-old bucks also are protected by it. And so it guarantees that yearling bucks are going to get to 2 years of age at at least.
I know that several bucks that walked in front of my bow this year were protected by it.
And so it absolutely gets the high grading out of the yearling age class. You're not high grading the yearlings, but what you're now doing is high grading the 2-year-olds because you're protecting some of the lower quality 2-year-olds. So you're just shifting the age at which you high grade. But as a state agency, you're protecting at least all of the yearlings, and you're not high grading the yearlings. You're just high grading the 2-year-olds, and the average hunter is just happy to see a 2-year-old buck. Mm-hmm.
And you've probably improved sex ratio because you have more bucks in the population. You're going to have a more intense rut, and I mean, there's just so many benefits of that. And Steve, we're talking about with these types of regulations are really more like state agency, very, very broad and region scale. Mm-hmm. At the club level, the one we ran across years and years ago was, hey, we're managing this property and we've got a good antler restriction, and you can't shoot a buck unless it has 8 points or more. That's kind of more of a private level. And and then, man, the rare occurrence, not so rare in some places, very rare in some parts of Mississippi, you get an 8-point yearling. Holy moly, what a rare buck that is. But because it had 8 points, it died. And so you can see right there the buck with the very, very best potential.
Who legitimately might have potential to be a 160 when he's...
Maybe so. And then that's the one, because it met the restriction, it gets harvested. And Steve, let me point back to, again, let's flip the script with our analogies here. We have both used the term high grading, which is generally, taking the best and leaving the rest. You're taking the best out and allowing the lower quality to grow up. What we're kind of flipping the script on is more of a timber stand improvement. Mm-hmm. It is now let's recognize that, like in a forest, there are finite resources: water, soil, sunlight, etc. We need to take some of those trees out of the forest. We're going to take the lowest quality trees out to give the better quality space and resources to grow. That's essentially what we're recommending with how to manage a buck population under this system, if it is your desire and objective.
Yes, if you're wanting pole timber, you want the very best trees to reach 20, 25, 30 years of age. And you're going to be thinning a couple of times along that way, and you might as well be thinning the lowest quality trees to get those poles, which is the highest dollar value timber.
So Luke, let me maybe circle back. We may have kind of got lost in our thoughts in the discussion here. So we are recommending whatever term you want to use. Sometimes it's a bad word, sometimes it's not, whether you want to say culling or management buck. Yeah, we do recommend that for this purpose that we just described, to manage density and recognizing that some deer need to be removed so we can allocate finite resources to the existing standing crop of bucks. But we in no way are we saying you're harvesting a buck that's a management buck or a cull for the purpose of improving genetics. Mm-hmm. That is, in our world, complete nonsense. You cannot do it.
Just a definition change.
Yeah.
So I've got two last things I want to ask about, and then probably about time to be signing off. So the first, and this is one of my favorite projects that I think the MSU Deer Lab has done. So how do we know, this refers to one of my favorite projects the MSU Deer Lab has done. What do we say about the buck that you might see on camera when he's 2 years old and he's just very average, right? He might be a 80, 85 inch 2-year-old, depending on where you're at, and he's just an average run-of-the-mill 2-year-old. And because of some unique maybe antler characteristic, or maybe he's got a nick on his ear, or he's got a unique, second throat patch or something, when he's 3 years old, he just blows up. And he's all of a sudden, he goes from being an average 2-year-old to now all of a sudden when he's 3, he's way above average. So how do we deal with that when we're harvesting yearlings? And how do we know that, and do we know that you're not gonna maybe harvest a yearling that is below average while he's a yearling, but by the time he gets to maturity, he might be above average?
Absolutely. It might be.
Yeah, but that can happen. And I think, and I'm going to give my 2 cents, and I think Steve may differ a little bit, so he can give his 2 cents.
That would make 5 cents in that.
To me, the younger you start applying, harvesting of management buck or cull bucks, the younger you go, the greater risk you have because of just what you're saying. The younger they are, the more sensitive they are to what was mother's condition. Were they born early? Were they born late? What was even, and this is something we've shown in some of our papers, what was the heat and drought conditions of the year the little buck fawn was conceived and in gestation? And what we typically see in Mississippi, maybe sooner other places, later other places, but when you start getting to about 3 years of age, those birth effects, maternal effects, etc., we typically think they start washing out. And you have a more reliable representation of what they are going to be at maturity. So Steve might come up with a situation where in this context and this environment, because of this, we would recommend selective harvest at the yearling age class. I think it can be done, but I think it's a very small set of circumstances where you can. If you're going to generalize, which is what we typically do, I would recommend the safest thing to do is to start implementing this type of harvest at 3 years of age.
I'm a little more aggressive, but again, I mean, an aggressive approach applies to a limited number of properties. You can't just start doing yearling buck selective harvest removal based on antler size criteria for yearling age bucks unless you have the full range of development of those yearling bucks on your property. So spike buck harvest is a bad word or a good word depending upon your point of view, but it really all depends. But years ago there was a philosophy, just shoot all your spikes as yearlings. Well, that might work some places, but in the lower coastal plain where 80 or 90% of your yearling bucks are spikes, that doesn't work. So don't apply. There's no such thing as cookie cutter deer management. Our friend Bob Griffin coined that term. You have to understand the context by which you're applying criteria and make it customized to that circumstance. But there are places where in better quality soil regions, in better quality habitats,
and earlier birth dates,
and earlier, good earlier birth dates, we don't have all these inhibitions that inhibit the expression of genetic potential at 1.5 years or 2.5 years of age. If you're in that circumstance where you have good conditions and valid expression, absolutely hit them hard earlier, because the only buck that most hunters can regularly and accurately identify is a yearling buck. Mm-hmm. And an old friend back in Texas Parks and Wildlife, Bill Armstrong, used to say,
"Oh yeah,
every hunter can count to 2. You count one spike, 2 spike, they can count to 2 and shoot it." But we don't apply that general of a rule to deer management because it wouldn't work in most places.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because there's certainly a difference between a spike that's got 1.5-inch spikes and a spike that's got 8-inch spikes. They might both be yearlings, but they represent vastly different potentials when they're 6 years old.
Yeah, and we did a study here in Lowndes County in East Mississippi along the Tombigbee River drainage, and it's above average habitat quality, soil resource quality. It's a pretty good area. And we wanted to test our theories from our selective simulations based on deer pen deer. We wanted to try it in the wild. The only way to do that is because you can't age deer absolutely definitively unless they're tagged as known age deer. We tagged them as fawns and yearling bucks and then followed them and captured them each year using trail cameras. And so we could estimate their antler size using our technology called buck score, which, well, that's another whole story. But it's something that we produced and is now licensed and is available for hunters to use.
Score through trail cam photos.
Yeah, score with reasonable accuracy. If you
score and age.
Score and age, or your bucks. So we use that in this technique and in this project, and we followed them through 4 years of age. And then we said, all right, of all the yearling bucks, let's look at some break points. And we, in this particular situation, I think about 50 to 60% of yearling bucks were spikes. So we don't want to just go out and shoot all the spikes. So, and we're not shooting any of these deer. We have them in a database now because they've lived and the cooperating landowners protected them and didn't harvest them. And so we look at all the all the yearling bucks and said, all right, well, there's a break, spikes less than 4 inches, spikes greater than 4 inches, and then yearlings that are forked antlered.
So that was roughly your thirds breakdown.
Roughly, yeah, it wasn't exactly, but it was meaningful things that you can apply as a hunter to as criteria. So a lower third, a middle third, and upper third. And we kept those deer in that category, in those categories, let them grow to 4 years of age in our database. And those 3 categories differed, the lower and the upper third differed by about 20 inches of antler score at 4 years of age. That's a meaningful difference. Now, so we manage deer populations on averages, and I know we're getting long on time here, but it's a complex series of questions, Luke. You're really putting it to us here, having us answer these questions in a single podcast. But now I lost my train of thought.
Doomed by the ramble.
Manage averages, not individuals.
Oh, yeah. You manage a deer population based on averages. We knew we could look at a deer and know that it was a year and a half or 2.5, 3.5 based on the ear tag, but we don't have that in a free-ranging, non-study population. So you have to make the best average based on averages. And so if you applied in that particular soil region in those circumstances, if you shot your yearling bucks that had 4 inches or less of antlers and left the middle third and the upper third to grow to maturity, you've removed a third of the bucks as part of population control. You have more food available for the remaining 2/3, and they're going to be bigger at 4 years of age than that lower third would have been by 20 inches. So it's a meaningful management approach. Now, back to Bronson's point, if you wait later, you can be more safe in your management decisions. If we looked at just 2-year-olds and grouped them at that stage into roughly thirds, then there was even greater separation among the 3 groups at 4 years of age. But when you get to, as soon as you get out of that yearling age class, it becomes harder to know that the deer is, you might look at that, well, yeah, deer is 2. Well, maybe it's 3. And then if you're trying to age a deer at 3, it would be great if you knew it was a 3-year-old deer. You could absolutely, with surety, say this is the deer to remove, but it's harder to age them at older ages. So if you're in a situation where the habitat quality and the population allows, removing earlier is more efficient.
Well, let me have, this isn't really a counterpoint, but I think it's another issue that comes up, is someone may say, okay, Dr. Damaris, that lower third, when they got to 4 or 5 years of age, what was the average antler score? And I just happened to be looking at the data you were talking about, and at 4 years of age, the average is about 115 inches for that lower third. And some people may say, and they are allowed to say it, they are welcome to say, you can feel what you want to feel. It's all based on your objectives. They may say, I would still love to have the opportunity to kill a 115-inch buck at maturity. And to that we say, absolutely. Go for it, have fun, do it. But if it is your objective to go, you're managing for that upper tier, that upper third, then you are going to provide more food resources for that upper third if you've removed the lower third along the way. It's all just conservation of food. And I'm going to dork out here for a minute. Steve, but you know what else follows a bell curve? If you remember way back when doing the Hobbs and Swift nutritional constraints modeling? Yeah. The concentration of resources in food. So there's a very, very low amount or biomass of plants that are of the highest quality.
Absolutely.
And so everything in biology, except for clutch size, pretty much follows this bell-shaped curve. And so you may have you may not perceive at all that food is limited, but generally, to some degree, it will be if you don't manage it.
And I actually remembered the other point I wanted to make, which is amazing. And maybe I can remember it all the way through actually saying it. So we've talked about a couple of different approaches to harvest today. We talked about high grading, which is selectively removing the better quality middle-aged deer. And we also talked about selectively removing the lower quality younger age deer. And both of those are they're antagonistic actions. The one is going to protect the better quality deer to grow older, but if you're shooting them at 3 years of age, then they're not getting older. And if you have like these antler criteria where, well, we're going to protect all the bucks until they get to 130. Well, the 3-year-old deer are going to, the upper third are going to get to 130 a lot quicker than the middle third or the lower third. And so you'll be hitting those 130 class bucks as soon as you can, as soon as you see them. And they're generally going to be the 3-year-old better bucks. And then the middle third might get 130 at 4 years of age, and you shoot those as 4-year-olds. And then the lowest third aren't going to get there maybe at all. So maybe some of them are never going to be harvested because you have this 130 rule. So you're feeding those 115s and 110s for their entire life. You're letting them die of old age. You can't do those kind of approaches with selective, with antler criteria alone. You have to be looking at antler size within age and making informed decisions based on your management goals. So we got these two antagonistic approaches, removing the lower third or differentially selectively removing the better third at a younger age. You don't want to do both of those things. But oftentimes in the properties that in the people that we hear from, they reach this point where they've had this 130 rule and they've been happy with it for a while, but then they just reach this plateau of our average deer are just 130 and we used to shoot an occasional 150 or 160. What is wrong? And Bronson has this great way of coming up with his terminology. What's the terminology you came up with for that?
I don't know if it's that great, but it kind of works. The glass ceiling, the buck management glass ceiling.
Absolutely.
You hit the glass ceiling, and instead of ascending like you normally would, you flatten out or you plateau, like you mentioned. And so 4-year-old bucks on average are not bigger than 3-year-olds. 5-year-olds on average aren't bigger than 4, which aren't bigger than 3. You flatten out at 3.5 years of age.
Yes, and we know the antler size should get larger to 6 years of age. Mm-hmm. So if you're really into the biggest mature deer you can grow, then you should be harvesting bucks at 5 and 6 and 7 years of age. And if your average deer if your 3-year-olds are the same size as your 5-year-olds, then you got a problem. And you can fix it though. And there's a way, we've been writing about this stuff for 20 years and talking about it on podcasts now for 3 or 4 years. We've put it all down into a book, and it's available very reasonably priced on Amazon. It's called Strategic Harvest System:
How to Break Through the Buck Management Glass Ceiling.
Okay. And so can we put in, we talked about putting in a link to...
Yeah, I can put in a link in the little show notes down there.
Okay, so the show notes are going to have a link to our video series, which is basically our 2-day workshop we'd given for many, literally decades. And actually the first deer workshop, a little historical point here, the first deer educational workshops were organized by Mississippi State University and the Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks back in the 1980s. And in the 1980s. And that was the start of educating landowners and hunters about effective deer management. And we carried that through, and others have picked up that approach and been very successful at educating hunters through these workshops.
Right.
And we just decided, well, we need to make it available to anybody, anytime, and that's where these video programs are.
People, it's just information. You don't have to drive and spend 2 days with us, as much as we would enjoy that. It's something you can sit in front of the computer and get all that information,
And then in that book we've written, we've basically taken the buck management component out of our deer workshops and put it all into this book. So if you read the book, watch the videos, you might not have to listen to our podcast ever again.
Oh, don't say that. Don't say that.
No, because Luke is going to keep coming up with new information. It's always going to be cutting edge. So you do need to keep listening to our podcasts.
Yeah, and on that note, just for all the listeners out there, if y'all have ideas of deer questions, blind spots that you feel like you get hit by every now and then when you're sitting around the campfire at deer camp and someone asks you something, you're like, oh, I don't know how to answer that. And you've, of course, listened to all of the podcasts that are on Deer University. Feel free to shoot us a DM in social media and make suggestions on things you'd like to hear about. And we'd be happy to, go there.
Shooting us a DM, what is that obscene?
See, there's a difference. See, Luke is in the world of DM. I know what it means, but I don't do it. I'm old-fashioned with email. Steve doesn't even know what it means. So.
Yeah, we got about 4.5 decades separating us in this 4-foot table.
I know what a BM means, but
it's not that.
No. Okay,
different. Yeah. Well, Luke, do you think we covered the topic? Well,
I think we did a good job. I'm sure we'll hear reviews from everyone else that thinks otherwise, but that's what we're here for.
And there's stuff that we didn't explain necessarily or brought up new questions. Give Luke a DM.
Yeah,
and let him know.
Give me a BM. I don't want one of those. I have enough of those BMs.
All right. Well, guys, I think that's a wrap. Thanks a bunch.
Hey, and you know what else? Hunting season's wrapping up.
Yeah,
it should be wrapped up unless you're doing something you shouldn't be doing in Mississippi.
Actually, some in Mississippi, in the southeast section, could still be hunting. But we had Luke and I had a wonderful last hunt in my part last Friday.
You had a wonderful last hunt last Friday.
Well, you had a wonderful day.
I had
too,
a wonderful
even
time
though
there.
You didn't harvest anything.
Yeah,
good time in the woods.
Yes,
we had a great day, and then you had one more hunt.
I did. That. Yep. I did have one more hunt after that.
And how'd that one go?
Well, that's we'll talk about that in detail after the podcast. But I had multiple deer underneath my tree stand.
Good.
All right.
And a lot of pigs.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Enjoyed it.
Thank you.
We thank the Patrick F. Taylor Foundation and the St. John and Dudley Hutchinson families for their endowed financial support of our efforts.
We also thank our employers, the Mississippi State University Extension Service and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center. If you have questions or suggestions, please log on to msudeerlab.com and click on the Deer University tab.